single greatest story that I was ever able to write when I worked for Jalopnik was the story of Ed Bolian breaking the cross-country record. A lot of people don't know this, but Ed and I were friends way before we were ever on YouTube. We were just like people, human people, like regular people. I was writing for Jalopnik, and I remember that Ed came to me, I think after the run had happened, and was like, I just broke the record. Will you write a piece about it? At the time, my writing on Jalopnik was like columns. Like I would write like humor columns, and I had developed a pretty good following as a result of that because my stories had a little bit more personality than just the regular writer's stories. And so it made sense for me to kind of be the guy to like deliver this piece. The problem with writing about it was that it was a very illegal thing. And Jalopnik's audience was very, I mean the entire internet, but the Jalopnik's audience was very like, you did this. There was some anxiety about whether that was okay, but I figured I gotta write this story. And I didn't even really contact my editors before I wrote the story. I was just like, we gotta get the story out and we'll see what happens. We met at like a coffee shop north of Atlanta. I remember you basically went through the whole story of the record and like how it had been, your preparation for it, the people you chose to go on it, how it had happened, etc. And we basically sat there for probably a couple hours and like you told me the whole thing. And I remember even then sitting there thinking like, this is the story of my life and I have to like write the hell out of it. Like I have to make it like amazing. At the time, I didn't know your co-driver Dave. I didn't know him, but I knew Dan, who was like your passenger. After talking to you for several hours about like, okay, here's what happened. And I wanted to get the whole story down so I could write this story well. I remember I called Dan for like his version of events because I wanted to get some quotes in there from him. I'll never forget there are a lot of things that I'll never forget about that whole situation, but I'll never forget that one of the things he told me was that it had not gone that well for you guys just before you ran. And I remember you got pulled over for making a illegal right on red in Manhattan. It was like a bad omen. And I remember he told me, and then I later told you, that he considered bailing. Like you guys had gone to some restaurant like right before you were gonna start the trip, and he literally was almost about to say out of his mouth, like, I'm not gonna do this, and decided against it. And so he rode with you in the tire. But so we went and sat and talked for several hours. I got the whole story from you, and I remember going home and being like, I need to not do anything tonight and just sit down and write this story. I remember that night, truly like the story came to me as if there was someone else writing it. Like it just flowed, like it was very easy. Very long, probably the longest published piece I've ever written. It's just a tremendous story. I mean, it was like a really good story. We set the cross-country record. And I remember at the time, the cross-country record had been kind of, especially among a certain group of car enthusiasts, like a pretty big deal. Alex Roy had written this book about his attempts to break the record. It was like a very special thing, you know. A lot of people think it is illegal and awful and terrible and that people should be punished for doing it, but I always felt that it was cool. Jalopnik immediately agreed that it was worth publishing and worth writing. And they knew, my editor, Matt Hardigree, he knew there was gonna be some blowback from the comments about glorifying this heinously illegal act, right? And I remember we added some softer language in the story to try to, hey, these guys were as careful as you can be. But I also remember that my editors at Jalopnik weren't sure they believed the story and had me go and write a lot of allegedlys in the piece. Because you had data, it's hard to like know what's real and what's fake. And also it had become clear to us that now that the story was out there, other people were gonna find out about it and we wanted to break it. We didn't wanna really verify every inch of the data, and we called your data company and they like washed their hands clean of it. You remember that? They were like, he used the data is genuine, but we don't know anything about any illegal acts. So we published the story. It was only a couple days later, and I remember I was in Nashville for a press launch of the Nissan Pathfinder Hybrid, which was one model year and utter trash. And I'd be stunned if even one still exists to this day. And what a horrible waste of my time on such a special day. But of course, we didn't know it would be such a special day. We launched the story and it instantly became like the internet's biggest sensation. Just Jalopnik writing the story and like publishing it. And at that point, my involvement was kind of over, but it was enough. The story was out there and there hadn't been a new challenger to the record in many years. And it was kind of viewed that like no one would really even try anymore. There was a lot more traffic, harder to evade the police, etc. And so like the fact that you broke it and broke it by such an enormous amount was a big deal in that community. And in the general car, this is always an interest of Americans, the cross-country drive. And the fact that someone could do it so quickly, people are very interested in that. It publishes, it goes live, and I remember it's just a huge, huge, huge deal. And there were a few interesting things that I remember almost in the immediate aftermath. One was, one of the comments on Jalopnik was a guy who said, I was in St. Louis in the middle of the night and somebody drove past me in a Mercedes, and I was wondering what that was. And I was like, huh. Like, that's, wow. Like, that, to me, that always stood out for me. Could have been lying, but like the way he wrote the comment, I will like kind of never forget that that was like a very special, like, oh, an interesting validation from a random observer. I met Dave Black at like Cars and Coffee the next week, and he brought the car. And that was the first time I had met Dave. The second time I met Dave. The first time, Dave's story was so bizarre. Dave had owned like a Jetta sport wagon and then decided to buy a Gallardo. And that's how you met him at the Lambo dealer, right? And you were like, find somebody who's crazy enough to do this with me. Well, Dave was just this kind of like random. He was like, all right, yeah, I'll probably do it. And so he didn't, I don't think, realize the fame that was about to come his way, at least in this small circle of individuals. And then I remember Dan telling me that he almost bailed. And those were all interesting. And then there was some blowback from some of the other people in the world of this, most notably from Alex Roy, who for some reason like scapegoated me as the writer of the story, even though I didn't do anything. He had always enjoyed kind of the notoriety of being the guy who had the record, which more notoriety came to him from that. Like was kind of a writer and sort of in the car scene, and especially New York City. And I think he was always a little bit miffed that he had kind of gotten taken down, and by a pretty wide margin. Like I have a suspicion that he had written this book about like all the prep that he did for the record and how hard it was. And I just think that he was like a little dismayed that like it just, it was beaten by such a big number. But he kind of was anti-Doug for a long period of time there. I haven't talked to him in a long time, but I think that that's all over. Then I remember there was some fear that the police would come for you, because Alex had, smartly or not, he had carefully waited until a year had gone. Statute of limitations was up on all the speeding laws. And you had decided not to, which your point was some of the laws, you could really make it into like a reckless, and like it could really be, like some of the statute of limitations could really be dragged on if someone wanted to be crazy, but it would be a lot of work for any jurisdiction to prove. And they never did, I think, right? There was a fear even like the day the article went live that the local police would like come and try to pick you up at the behest of some other department. That never happened. Now that I think about it, CNN reposted it. It was a massive story on CNN, the biggest story on CNN.com internationally. It was a huge deal, in part because also no one had tried to break the record for so long. Because what ended up happening then when other people kind of got in and started then chipping away at your time, it wasn't as big of a deal. Like your situation was such a big deal because it was like the first person in a long time. People had forgotten this was even a thing. It was cool. And I remember you telling me something that I always admired, which was like, it went wall-to-wall viral for a few weeks and then started kind of dying down, but you still had the story to be able to tell people forever. You were like, I got exactly what I wanted to get out of it. Just like a little bit of notoriety. It was fun. It was cool. We did it. We set this record. There's really not much more to it. Like it was never going to become like you were going to go to Hollywood and become but it was what it was. And it was the fun thing. And I thought it was really cool. And it really was the most special story I've ever been lucky enough to write. I got emails from other people saying, anytime you want to write anything for me, now you can. That was one of the things that sort of started to build me up on Jalopnik. There's no question. And just being able to get that access, I mean, we just knew each other. It was that level of like kind of randomness of it happening.
Our sponsor for this month of VINwiki Car Stories is Bridgestone, and I just had a set of their brand new Jeweler AT Ascent tires installed on my Porsche Cayenne Turbo. Now with this off-road Cayenne project, I've experimented with 8 different wheel and tire combinations, and I really think this is the perfect solution. I still get all of the all-terrain benefits, the off-road performance that I want, and the indestructibility that I love, but I also get a 40,000 mile warranty and all the road composure that I lost with some of the other tire options. So I get the best of both worlds, off-road, on-road, as well as all the latest technology from Bridgestone. Of course, we love their Potenza range of tires for sports cars and supercars, but now their Jeweler AT Ascent is the perfect solution for your on and off-road needs. So click the link in the description below now to learn more about Bridgestone and see what they've got for your car.